She was just another inmate. Just another name on a list. Another woman in an orange jumpsuit, moving through the system, counted, processed, forgotten. At least, that's what they wanted her to be. But then, something happened. Something that should have been impossible. Inside a place where every movement is watched, where every door is locked, where freedom is a memory, she became pregnant. No visitors. No conjugal rights. No explanation. And before anyone could ask the right questions, before she could tell her side of the story, she was dead. The official report was quick. Neat. Convenient. A suicide, they said. A woman who had lost hope, taking matters into her own hands. But inside these walls, rumors move faster than the guards. And what they were saying didn't match the story written in ink on an official report. Some say she knew something she wasn't supposed to. That she had seen something, heard something, something dangerous. Others say she had been warned to stay quiet and didn't listen. A Texas prison. A woman with a secret. A death no one can explain. Was it desperation? A tragic end to a troubled life? Or was it something else? Something that was never meant to be uncovered? Deep in the heart of Texas, just outside the small town of Gatesville, stands the Mountain View Unit, a maximum security prison built to contain the state's most dangerous female offenders. Its walls hold those convicted of murder, violent assaults, and crimes that shook entire communities. It is a place where time moves slowly, where the outside world fades, and where secrets stay buried. But in 2019, one secret refused to stay hidden. On the morning of April 16, a routine medical checkup turned into a scandal that would shake the entire facility. One of the inmates, 29-year-old Jeannie Lee McGinty, was pregnant. She had arrived at Mountain View 3 years earlier, sentenced to 18 years for armed robbery. It was a crime that had left an elderly gas station clerk injured, a mistake that had sealed her fate. Jeannie wasn't a model inmate, but she wasn't a troublemaker either. She kept her head down, did her time, and followed the rules. But now, all eyes were on her. She had no visitors. No conjugal privileges. No reason to be pregnant. Prison officials were quick to contain the situation. They assured the press that an internal investigation was underway. That every guard and staff member would be questioned. That Mountain View had strict policies, male officers were never alone with female inmates, surveillance covered nearly every inch of the facility, and unauthorized contact was impossible. And yet, there it was. A fact that couldn't be denied. Inside the prison, the rumors spread fast. Some inmates whispered about a secret relationship. Others talked about something far more disturbing: coercion, threats, favors exchanged in the blind spots of security cameras. Jeannie didn't stay quiet. She asked questions. She wanted answers. And then, before those answers could come, she was dead. Authorities ruled it a suicide. The official report claimed she had taken her own life in the early hours of May 3, just weeks after her pregnancy was discovered. But those who knew her, those who had spoken to her in the days before, didn't believe it. A woman locked away in a high-security prison. A pregnancy that shouldn't have been possible. A death that raised more questions than it answered. What really happened to Jeannie McGinty? And who wanted to make sure she never told her story? Inside Mountain View Unit, everything is controlled. Every door is locked. Every step is counted. Every inmate is monitored. But not everything is seen. Not everything is stopped. For months, before anyone outside these walls knew her name, before news cameras turned their attention to her, Jeannie McGinty moved through her sentence like so many others. Day in, day out, one of the hundreds of women confined behind concrete and steel. Another face in a place where time is slow and silence is survival. But the silence wasn't absolute. There were whispers. Quiet exchanges in the chow hall, coded messages passed in the laundry, glances traded between inmates who knew how to read the signs. Jeannie was getting attention. Attention from someone who wasn't supposed to notice her. Someone with power. Someone who could make things happen. His name was Officer Daniel Crowley. A guard who had worked at Mountain View for nearly 7 years. By the book. Unremarkable. Just another uniform in a place full of them. To the outside world, he was a professional. Inside, the story was different. It started with small things. It always does. A few extra minutes outside her cell. A meal tray with a little more food than the others. A job reassignment that placed her in areas where he worked. A conversation that lingered a little too long. At first, no one questioned it. Guards have favorites. Some inmates are easier to deal with than others. But then the pattern became clear. Jeannie was getting away with things others couldn't. She wasn't searched as thoroughly during pat-downs. She was sent on errands that gave her moments alone in places where no one should be alone. And when her name came up for disciplinary action, warnings seemed to disappear before they reached the warden's desk. Some saw it as a stroke of luck. Others saw it for what it was. Grooming. Some women in Mountain View had been through it before. They knew the routine. How it starts with favors. With kindness. With protection. Then, the rules start to bend. And by the time you realize they've broken completely, it's too late to escape. One inmate, who later spoke only under the promise of anonymity, claimed she had seen them together in places they weren't supposed to be. Empty hallways. Storage rooms. Offices where the cameras were broken, where the doors could be locked. She wasn't the only one who noticed. Other guards began to talk. Some of them laughed it off. Others looked the other way. Because inside a prison, not every rule is enforced. And not every warning is heard. And then, everything changed. The pregnancy was discovered during a routine medical check. A simple blood test, nothing out of the ordinary. Jeannie didn't deny it. She barely reacted at all. When the nurse confronted her with the results, she simply said, "You tell me." The news spread through the prison within hours. A pregnant inmate. No visitation rights. No conjugal privileges. There was no official announcement, but everyone knew. The officers knew. The inmates knew. And the administration knew. There was no hiding what had happened. The question wasn't if it had happened. The question was who was responsible. It didn't take long for the rumors to settle on one name. Crowley. At first, the administration moved quickly, to contain the damage. The warden issued a statement assuring the public that an internal investigation was underway. That protocols were being reviewed. That no one would be above accountability. But inside Mountain View, nothing changed. Jeannie was transferred to another housing unit, placed under medical watch. She was told to remain silent. That everything was being handled. Crowley. He kept his job. There was no immediate suspension. No interrogation. No arrest. He continued his shifts as if nothing had happened. Because in places like Mountain View, the system protects itself first. Outside the prison walls, the world was watching. News outlets picked up the story. Local journalists pushed for answers. Advocacy groups demanded transparency. How does a woman in a high-security prison, under constant supervision, become pregnant? Who was responsible? And why was the man at the center of it still free to walk the halls of Mountain View? The Texas Department of Criminal Justice responded with careful, measured words. A review was underway. Protocols would be re-evaluated. But they didn't call it what it was. Not assault. Not coercion. Instead, they used words like misconduct. Inappropriate relationship. As if what had happened was a mistake. A lapse in judgment. Crowley denied everything. He claimed Jeannie had been involved with another inmate. That she had manipulated the system. That someone else was responsible. But inside Mountain View, the women knew the truth. They had seen this before. And they knew what happened to women who spoke out. Jeannie had two choices: accept the story she was being given, or fight. She chose to fight. She started asking questions. She demanded to speak with investigators. She wrote letters to advocacy groups, to journalists, to anyone who would listen. She was no longer just another inmate. She was a problem. And inside Mountain View, problems don't last long. Because less than 3 weeks after her pregnancy was discovered, Jeannie McGinty was found dead. The morning of May 3rd began like any other inside Mountain View. At 4:45 a.m. The first shift of guards made their rounds. They walked the long corridors, checking each cell one by one, their flashlights sweeping across sleeping inmates. The prison was still, locked in a heavy quiet that only came in the early hours before the facility stirred to life. At 5 a.m., breakfast trays were slid through the metal slots. A routine so mechanical it had become muscle memory. At 5:30 a.m., the wake-up call was issued over the intercom. The clank of bed frames, the shuffle of inmates getting ready for the day. But in cell 217, there was no movement. At first, it was nothing unusual. Some inmates ignored morning roll call, refusing to get up, stretching the few extra minutes before a guard forced them to. But when Jeannie McGinty's name was called again, louder this time, there was no response. A guard knocked on the door. No answer. Knocked again. Still nothing. He peered through the small window. The cell was dim, the single overhead light casting a pale glow over the narrow space. Jeannie was lying on her bunk, her back turned toward the door, her body still under the thin, standard-issue blanket. The guard hesitated. He called for her again. No movement. Something felt off. He pulled out his keys, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. That was when he saw it. A strip of fabric, torn from a bedsheet, wrapped loosely around her neck. At 5:42 a.m., a code blue was called over the prison radio. Medical staff rushed in. Officers followed. The scene was immediately secured. By the time paramedics arrived, she was already gone. The official statement came quickly: suicide by hanging. She had taken her own life, they said. A young woman, facing the weight of an uncertain future. Pregnant, alone, accused of an improper relationship with a guard. Overwhelmed. A tragic ending. A closed case. But inside Mountain View, no one believed it. Not the women who had spoken to her the night before. Not the inmates who knew she had been fighting. Who knew she had been planning to speak. And not her family, who received the news in a cold, detached phone call that left them with more questions than answers. Her mother, Susan McGinty, had spoken to her just 2 days earlier. Jeannie had sounded tired, but determined. She had mentioned a lawyer. An interview. She had said, "I just need to hold on a little longer." And now, she was gone. But something wasn't adding up. The official autopsy ruled it self-inflicted. But the details raised questions. She had no prior suicide attempts. No recorded history of self-harm. She had spent the past weeks planning her next steps, not preparing for an end. The bedsheets in Mountain View were designed to tear under weight, a standard measure to prevent suicides. And yet, somehow, hers had held. There were bruises on her wrists. Light marks along her arms. Injuries inconsistent with a simple hanging. The report noted them, but didn't explain them. There was no toxicology report. No follow-up investigation. Just an official conclusion: suicide. Her family demanded answers. How had she been left alone long enough to take her own life? Why had she been moved to a different cell block just days before her death? And why, despite being pregnant, had she received almost no medical care. The Texas Department of Criminal Justice issued a statement. They expressed their condolences. They stood by the findings. They called it a tragedy. But inside the prison, the story was different. Jeannie had spent her last days asking questions. She had written letters to advocacy groups, to lawyers, to anyone who might listen. She was pushing back. And Officer Crowley? He was no longer at Mountain View. Within days of Jeannie's death, he had resigned. No charges. No disciplinary action. Just a quiet departure. A clean slate. Some called it a coincidence. Others called it something else. Jeannie McGinty had been ready to tell her story. But now, she never would. 2 weeks after Jeannie McGinty was found dead in her cell, Officer Daniel Crowley was placed under investigation. Not arrested. Not charged. Just investigated. The Texas Department of Criminal Justice released a carefully worded statement. They assured the public that all allegations were being taken seriously. That there would be a full review of Crowley's conduct. That if wrongdoing was found, appropriate action would follow. But Crowley had already resigned. By the time his name made the evening news, he was no longer employed by Mountain View. No longer subject to the internal policies that might have held him accountable. And so, as far as the prison was concerned, he was no longer their problem. Crowley denied everything. He maintained that Jeannie had lied. That she had manipulated the system. That he had never been alone with her, never crossed the line. He said the pregnancy wasn't his. That he was a scapegoat. And without Jeannie to testify, there was no case. The investigation stretched for months. Reports were compiled. Witnesses were questioned. But inmates' testimonies carried little weight against an officer's word. And when the final decision came, it was exactly what many had expected. Insufficient evidence. No charges were filed. Crowley walked free. After the media storm, Mountain View Unit made a promise. They assured the public that changes were coming. That new policies would be put in place. That what happened to Jeannie McGinty would never happen again. And yet, inside those walls, very little changed. Security cameras that had been broken for years remained broken. Officers continued to work long, grueling shifts with little oversight. And the unofficial rule that had always governed places like Mountain View remained unspoken but firm: don't ask too many questions. The case faded from headlines. Other scandals took its place. And for the women still incarcerated inside Mountain View, life continued. Business as usual. But one question remained. What happened to Jeannie's child? According to medical records, she had been approximately 4 months pregnant at the time of her death. The autopsy confirmed it. But in the reports, there was no mention of whether any efforts had been made to save the unborn baby. Could the child have survived? The prison had no answers. They called it an unfortunate circumstance. A secondary loss. A tragedy. And that was where the story ended. No name. No birth certificate. No further investigation. The child, like its mother, was forgotten. But not everyone forgot. Jeannie's family refused to let the story disappear. Her mother, Susan McGinty, spent years trying to reopen the case. She filed complaints. She spoke to journalists. She worked with advocacy groups, demanding answers that no one seemed willing to give. She never stopped asking. Who was responsible for her daughter's pregnancy? Who benefited from her silence? And was her death truly a suicide, or something else? Years later, those questions remain. No one was held accountable. No one faced justice. And Mountain View Unit continued to operate, its walls holding secrets that would never see the light of day. But for those who knew Jeannie McGinty, who remembered her not just as an inmate but as a daughter, a sister, a woman who had once dreamed of something better, The case was never truly closed. Jeannie McGinty's story ends the way so many others do. A few newspaper headlines. A press release filled with carefully chosen words. An internal investigation that yields no real consequences. A name that fades from public memory, slipping into the vast archive of cases that were never truly solved. She was a woman who made mistakes. A woman who had been convicted of a crime. But does a prison sentence mean a person's life has less value? That their voice matters less? If Jeannie had lived, she would have faced scrutiny. Some would have called her a liar. Others would have dismissed her as just another inmate trying to manipulate the system. But she never got that chance. Because before she could tell her story, she was gone. And that's what lingers. The timing. The details that don't add up. The way Officer Crowley was allowed to walk away, his career untarnished. The way Mountain View Unit continued operating as if nothing had happened. And the biggest question of all, was this truly a case of desperation, or was it something else? Suicide is the explanation they gave. But inmates who spoke to Jeannie the night before said she was still fighting. That she still believed she could win. That she was afraid, yes, but determined. She had plans. She was ready to speak. Ready to name names. Ready to expose a system that had failed her, over and over again. And then, just hours later, she was gone. Coincidence? Or something more? The official investigation was closed in less than a month. No external oversight. No second autopsy. No criminal charges. Just a statement from the Texas Department of Criminal Justice expressing their condolences and an assurance that protocols would be reviewed. But inside Mountain View, those protocols hadn't saved Jeannie. They hadn't stopped her from being preyed upon. They hadn't protected her when she needed it most. And they certainly hadn't stopped the silence that followed her death. For Jeannie's family, the fight for answers never stopped. Her mother, Susan, spent years filing complaints, pushing for another investigation, demanding that someone, anyone, acknowledge that what happened wasn't just a tragedy, but a failure. She wanted people to care. She wanted people to see her daughter the way she had, flawed, yes, but still human. Still deserving of justice. But the machine kept turning. The world moved on. And Jeannie McGinty became another name on a long list of cases where the truth never fully came to light. Some cases get justice. Others get buried. Some voices are heard. Others are silenced. And yet, stories like Jeannie's don't completely disappear. They remain in the shadows, waiting. Because as long as people are still asking questions, there's still a chance that the truth might come out. So what do you think happened? Was Jeannie McGinty a woman who saw no way out, or was she silenced before she could speak? Did she take her own life, or was it taken from her? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you thought this case was shocking, wait until you hear about what happened at Pine Ridge Correctional Facility. A missing inmate. A falsified transfer order. And a secret that took 15 years to surface. But that's a story for next time.